The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon spun up with a sound like a chainsaw from hell. Captain Willow Evans felt the A-10 Thunderbolt shudder as 30mm rounds began pouring out at 70 rounds per second, each one capable of punching through tank armor like tissue paper. Below her, the enemy column stretched for 3 miles, 35 T-72 tanks, 40 armored personnel carriers, God knows how many support vehicles, all moving in tight formation through the valley they thought was safe. They were wrong. The first tank exploded before the sound of her gun even reached the ground, the depleted uranium round finding the ammunition storage and turning 50 tons of steel into a fireball that lit up the pre-dawn darkness. Then the second tank. Then the third. The column was starting to panic, vehicles swerving, trying to scatter, but there was nowhere to go in the narrow valley, and Evans was already lining up her next pass. This wasn't going to be a battle. This was going to be a massacre. And it had started 20 minutes ago when command told her that hitting this column was impossible. The briefing had been brief and bleak. Armored column moving through Kashar Valley, 35 main battle tanks minimum. Window closes in 40 minutes when they reach air defense coverage. Every strike package we've sent got turned back. Weather's too bad, valley's too narrow, SAM sites on the ridges. Colonel Masters had looked at the pilots assembled in the ready room with tired eyes. We need someone crazy enough to try. Captain Willow Evans, 29, 5 years in A-10s, 47 combat sorties, stood up. I'll take it. Captain, you understand what I'm saying? 3 aircraft have already aborted. The approach is through the valley at terrain following altitude under the cloud deck, too low for SAMs to track effectively. I'll need to go in alone. Formation flight won't work in those conditions. Give me the coordinates. Masters studied her. No pilot could hit that column in those conditions. Evans smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. Command said no pilot could. They didn't say I couldn't. 15 minutes later, she was strapped into her A-10, engines spooling up, weapons pylons loaded with Maverick missiles, and enough 30mm ammunition to destroy a small city. The Warthog wasn't pretty, wasn't fast, wasn't sophisticated, but it was tough as hell and built around the most devastating gun ever mounted on an aircraft. Perfect for what she was about to do. The flight to the valley took 12 minutes at low altitude, screaming over terrain and darkness with nothing but instruments and the faint glow of pre-dawn to navigate by. Weather was deteriorating, cloud ceiling dropping, visibility going to shit. Exactly the conditions that had turned back the other pilots. Evans flew lower. The valley appeared ahead, a dark slash cutting through mountains that rose like walls on either side. Narrow, maybe half a mile wide at the mouth, narrowing to a quarter mile further in. Flying through it would be threading a needle while someone shot at you and the needle was moving. She threaded the needle. The A-10 dropped into the valley at 300 feet, terrain screaming past on either side. Through the murk, she could see them. The column, stretched out like a metal snake, vehicles moving in what they thought was safety. Evans armed her weapons. The targeting pod painted the first tank. Range, 4,000 meters. Target locked. She fired the first Maverick missile from 3 miles out, watched it streak away on a pillar of flame, tracked it all the way to impact. The explosion bloomed orange against the gray dawn. Target 1, destroyed. But she wasn't stopping to admire her work. The A-10 roared over the burning wreckage at 300 knots, her hands already selecting the next target. Maverick 2 away. Another explosion. Another tank converted to scrap metal. The column was reacting now. She could see vehicles trying to disperse, commanders realizing they were under attack, but not understanding from where. The weather and terrain made visual acquisition nearly impossible. They were being killed by something they couldn't see. Evans made that problem worse. She pulled hard on the stick, climbing above the valley walls, using the terrain to mask her approach for the gun run. The GAU-8 was loaded with a mix of armor-piercing incendiary and high-explosive incendiary rounds. Each one weighed almost 2 pounds. She was about to deliver several tons of hate in 30 seconds. The A-10 rolled inverted at the top of her climb, Evans looking up through the canopy at the ground below, picking her angle. The valley stretched out beneath her, The column now in chaos, vehicles scattered but still clustered enough for what she had in mind. She rolled upright and dove. The dive was steep, 45 degrees, the A-10 accelerating to 400 knots, the airframe shaking as she pushed it to speeds it wasn't designed for. The targeting pipper in her heads-up display walked across the valley floor, tracking toward the densest concentration of armor, 2,000 feet, 1,500, 1,000. Evans squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 erupted with its distinctive thunderous roar. The sound inside the cockpit was incredible, even through her helmet, a continuous mechanical scream that shook the entire aircraft. The A-10 slowed visibly from the recoil, 3 tons of thrust from the engines, 1 ton of opposite thrust from the gun. Simple physics applied to violence. Below, the effect was catastrophic. 30-millimeter rounds walked through the column like the finger of an angry god, each impact creating sparks and fire. Armor plating that could stop conventional weapons was punched through by depleted uranium penetrators, traveling at 3,000 feet per second. Tanks exploded, APCs burst into flames, support vehicles disintegrated. Evans held the trigger for 4 seconds, 280 rounds, nearly 500 pounds of ammunition delivered into a space the size of a football field. She pulled out of the dive at 500 feet, the A-10's wings groaning under 8 Gs of load, her vision graying at the edges despite the pressure suit squeezing her legs. Behind her, the valley floor looked like someone had carpet-bombed it. But she wasn't done. The A-10 rocketed up the valley, Evans standing the aircraft on its tail, climbing nearly vertical, using all that momentum to gain altitude for the next pass. At the top of the climb, she rolled again, surveying the damage. 18 vehicles burning, maybe 20 more trying to scatter. And the SAM sites on the ridges were finally waking up, radar signals painting her aircraft, missile batteries training toward the threat they'd finally identified. "Come on then," Evans muttered, rolling into her next attack. The SAM sites launched first. She saw them. 4 missiles coming off the rails from 2 different positions, their rocket motors bright against the gray morning. They were SA-8 Gecko systems, old Soviet gear, but still deadly if they connected. Evans wasn't going to let them connect. She rolled the A-10 into a split S, pulling the nose down and diving back into the valley, using the terrain to break the missile's radar lock. At the same time, she punched chaff and flares, the aircraft spitting out clouds of radar-reflective material and blazing infrared decoys. The first missile lost lock, flew stupid, impacted the valley wall in a fireball that shook the A-10 even from a half-mile away. The second missile followed her into the valley, tracking through the chaff, its radar seeker locked on the biggest return in the sky. Evans waited until it was 3 seconds from impact. Then she rolled 90 degrees and pulled hard, bleeding energy in the turn, the missile unable to match the turn radius at her slower speed. It flew past, proximity fuse detonating 20 meters away. The blast wave hammered the A-10, shrapnel peppering the armored fuselage with metallic pings that sounded like hail on a tin roof. Warning lights illuminated on her dash, hydraulic pressure dropping in the secondary system. She could feel the stick getting heavier, control surfaces responding sluggishly. The A-10 had triple redundant flight controls specifically for this scenario, taking damage and continuing to fight. 2 missiles defeated, 2 more tracking. She went lower, down to 200 feet, the valley walls flashing past her wingtips so close she could see individual rocks. At this altitude, the missile's minimum engagement range became a problem. For them. They couldn't maneuver effectively, their control surfaces maxed out trying to match her terrain-following flight. The third missile couldn't hack the turn, overshot and detonated against the valley wall behind her in a cascade of rock and fire. The fourth missile was smarter, or luckier. It stayed locked, tracking her every move, closing the distance with relentless precision. Evans jinked hard left, then right, then left again, making herself an impossible target, the missile trying to follow but burning energy with each correction. She could see it in her rearview mirror, a white contrail getting closer, the warhead that would tear her aircraft apart if it connected. At the last possible second, she pulled into a violent climbing turn, the A-10's engines screaming at full military power, the airframe shaking from the stress that would have torn lesser aircraft apart. The missile tried to follow, tried to match the sudden vector change, but physics was undefeated. It couldn't pull the G's required, shot past her belly by mere feet, and detonated in front of her position. The blast wave hit the A-10 like a physical wall. Evans felt the aircraft pitch forward violently, the nose dropping, altitude bleeding away in seconds. More warning lights, fire warning on engine 2, multiple hydraulic failures, electrical system flickering. The cockpit filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning insulation. She fought the controls, wrestling the aircraft level, shutting down the damaged engine before it could fully ignite, running through emergency procedures with the kind of muscle memory that came from hundreds of hours in simulators, practicing exactly this scenario. The A-10 kept flying, barely, sluggishly, but flying. 4 missiles defeated, valley clear of active threats, time to finish the job. Evans looked down at the column through the smoke haze in her cockpit. The remaining tanks were breaking into 3 groups, 5 vehicles racing for the valley exit, 4 trying to find defensive positions among the rocks, and 3 that had simply stopped. Their crews, probably debating whether staying in the vehicles or running on foot, gave them better survival odds. She decided to answer that question for them. Rolling into another gun run despite the damaged aircraft, Evans lined up on the 5 fleeing tanks. They were moving at maybe 40 kilometers per hour, racing along the valley floor in single file, heading for the air defense coverage that represented safety. She gave them the gun from directly behind, the GAU-8 roaring one more time, rounds chasing the fleeing vehicles like death on wings. The first tank's engine compartment exploded, the vehicle slewing sideways and blocking the narrow valley. The second tank tried to swerve around, clipped the wreckage, threw a track, and ground to a halt. The remaining 3 tried to reverse, backing up frantically. Evans reversed her turn, came back around, and put bursts into all 5 from an oblique angle that let her rounds penetrate the thinner side armor. All 5 erupted in flames within 10 seconds, their crews bailing out into the killing zone, running for cover that didn't exist. She saw infantry scrambling from the burning APCS, soldiers carrying shoulder-fired missiles. MANPADS that could bring down an aircraft if they got a lock. Half a dozen men were spreading out, trying to establish firing positions, weapons tracking her aircraft. Evans didn't give them time to set up. She came around in a tight turn that made the damaged A-10 groan in protest, dropped to 50 feet above the valley floor, and opened up with the GAU-8 on the infantry positions. The 30mm rounds didn't just kill individual soldiers. They created a beaten zone of destruction that eliminated entire squads in seconds. Rock and dirt erupted in massive plumes, the high-explosive rounds detonating on impact, shrapnel scything through anyone unlucky enough to be in the open. The infantry threat evaporated, literally. One moment there were soldiers setting up to shoot at her. The next moment there was just smoke and cratered ground. 23 tanks destroyed, 12 remaining. The 4 tanks that had gone defensive were hull down behind rocks, turrets traversing to track her aircraft, main guns elevating. They were going to try shooting at her with their 125mm cannons, low probability of hitting an aircraft. But if they connected, 1 round would be enough. Evans didn't give them the chance. She popped up above the ridgeline, giving them a target for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for them to aim, not long enough to fire. 4 turrets swiveled toward her position. She could see the gun barrels tracking, commanders making range calculations, gunners settling crosshairs on her aircraft. She dropped back below the ridge before they could shoot, came around the valley wall at high speed, and emerged from an angle they weren't covering. The defensive positions that had been perfect for covering the valley floor were completely exposed to her flanking attack. The GAU-8 spoke again, and 4 more tanks became funeral pyres. The rounds came in from the side, found ammunition storage, and turned armored vehicles into pressure cookers that vented their contents skyward in spectacular explosions. 1 turret flew nearly 100 feet in the air, tumbling end over end before crashing back to Earth. 27 tanks destroyed, 8 remaining. But Evans's situational awareness was screaming at her. Something was wrong. The valley was too quiet suddenly. The remaining tanks weren't moving, weren't shooting, weren't doing anything. They were just sitting there like they were waiting for something. Then she saw it, movement on the ridgeline, not Sam's, worse. Mobile anti-aircraft guns, ZSU-23-4 Shilka systems, 4-barreled rapid-fire cannons that could put up a wall of lead that nothing could fly through. They'd been hidden under camouflage netting, waiting for exactly this moment when an aircraft was committed to an attack run and couldn't easily disengage. The Shilkas opened fire simultaneously, all 4 systems tracking her aircraft, their radar-guided guns putting out a combined 16,000 rounds per minute. The sky filled with tracers, a glowing net of death that turned the airspace into a blender. Evans saw the tracers coming and did the only thing she could. She went up. Not gradually, not in a smooth climb, but in a violent nose-up pull that took the A-10 nearly vertical, engines at maximum power, climbing like a rocket to get above the gun envelope. The Shilkas tracked upward, their guns elevating, tracers following her climb. She could hear impacts, rounds hitting her aircraft, punching through the non-critical areas, finding gaps in the armor. More warning lights, more systems failing. The A-10 was being chewed apart by 4 angry Shilkas, and there was nothing she could do about it except keep climbing and hope she cleared their maximum elevation angle before they landed a critical hit. At 8,000 feet, she rolled inverted and pulled through, coming back down in a split S that put her on the opposite side of the valley from the Shilkas. The anti-aircraft guns tried to track her, but she was moving too fast, already accelerating in the dive, building energy for what came next. She had 2 Mavericks left. She used them both on the Shilka positions, firing from maximum range, watching the missiles streak across the valley and detonate among the anti-aircraft guns. 2 Shilkas destroyed outright, a 3rd damaged, its radar dome blown off, guns silent. The 4th was still operational, still tracking, still firing. Evans pointed her nose at it and gave it the gun from a mile away, walking her fire across the ridgeline until the depleted uranium rounds found the Shilka and tore it apart. The ammunition in its magazines cooked off in a secondary explosion that looked like a fireworks display. Air defense suppressed, valley truly clear now. Time to finish the remaining tanks. The last group, 3 tanks that had stopped moving, suddenly lurched into motion, their commanders making the decision to run rather than fight. Smart move, but too late. Evans had altitude and energy advantage, and they were in the open with no air defense to protect them. She rolled inverted, pulled through to point her nose at the ground, and dove nearly vertical. The A-10 accelerated past 400 knots, the damaged airframe protesting but holding together because Fairchild Republic had built it to take incredible punishment. At 1,000 feet, she opened fire, the targeting pipper centered on the lead tank. The GAU-8's depleted uranium rounds rained down like meteors, each one hitting with kinetic energy that turned armor into confetti. The lead tank exploded. The second tank tried to swerve, caught rounds in the engine deck, and burst into flames. The third tank attempted to accelerate, to somehow outrun the death falling from above. It couldn't. Evans walked her fire across its path, rounds impacting on and around the vehicle until one found the critical spot, probably the ammunition compartment, and the tank came apart in a detonation so violent it left a crater in the valley floor. 30 tanks destroyed, 5 remaining. But her gun had gone silent, ammunition counter reading 0. She'd fired over 1,100 rounds of 30mm, depleting the massive magazine that fed the GAU-8. The remaining 5 tanks were scattered across the valley, and she had no gun left to engage them. She had no Mavericks left either. Winchester on all offensive systems. She was a fighter with no weapons, except one, the aircraft itself, and her ability to manipulate enemy psychology. The remaining tanks were making a break for it, racing toward the valley exit in desperate formation. Evans calculated angles, distances, speeds. She had maybe 90 seconds before they reached safety. She pointed the A-10 at the lead tank and went to full military power on her remaining good engine. The aircraft accelerated, diving toward the fleeing vehicle, Evans lining up like she was going to strafe, except she had no ammunition to strafe with. The tank commander must have seen her coming, must have thought he was about to be shredded by the gun because the vehicle swerved hard left. trying to evade. The driver overcorrected. The tank slewed sideways at high speed on loose terrain, and at 40 kilometers per hour with 50 tons of momentum, the vehicle flipped, just rolled over like a toy, crushing its own turret, trapping its crew inside the inverted hull. 31 tanks destroyed, 1 mobility killed by intimidation tactics, 3 remaining. Evans pulled up from her mock attack run and immediately rolled into another dive toward the second tank. Same tactic, make them think she was about to fire, force an evasive maneuver on terrain that couldn't support it. The second tank's driver saw her coming and slammed on the brakes, trying to stop rather than maneuver. Bad decision. The tank behind him couldn't stop in time, slammed into his rear at full speed, both vehicles getting tangled in a collision that threw tracks, jammed turrets, and left them immobilized in the middle of the valley. 2 more tanks effectively destroyed without firing a shot. 33 tanks destroyed or mobility killed. 2 remaining. The last 2 tanks had the wisdom to stop moving entirely, their commanders recognizing that evasive maneuvers were more dangerous than the aircraft that apparently had no ammunition left. They sat still, hoping she'd leave, hoping the damaged aircraft would run out of fuel or crash trying to make another pass. Evans had other ideas. She circled overhead, assessing options. No weapons, damaged aircraft, limited fuel. 2 tanks that were now stationary and aware that she couldn't hurt them directly. But she had one more trick, her radio and fire support coordination frequencies. Paladin 6, this is Ghost 1-1, requesting immediate fire mission, over. The artillery battalion commander came back instantly. Ghost 1-1, Paladin 6, send it. End. Evans read off coordinates with the precision of a forward observer who'd spent years training for exactly this scenario. She adjusted fire, walked the artillery rounds onto target, talked the guns through corrections with calm professional efficiency, despite flying a crippled aircraft through hostile airspace. 30 seconds later, 155mm howitzer rounds began landing in the valley. The first salvo bracketed the 2 tanks, explosions erupting in massive plumes of dirt and smoke. Evans called corrections. The second salvo landed closer. The third salvo was direct hits. Both tanks erupted in flames as high explosive rounds found weak points in their top armor. The crews tried to bail out, but artillery continued to fall, the valley floor becoming a moonscape of craters and shrapnel. 1 crew made it out of their burning vehicle and tried to run for cover. Evans called 1 more correction, and the next artillery salvo landed directly on their position. When the smoke cleared, nothing was moving. 35 tanks destroyed. Mission complete. 100% effectiveness. Evans ceased fire, confirmed ground forces were moving in to secure the valley, and turned her damaged aircraft toward home. The A-10 was flying on borrowed time. 1 engine, degraded controls, multiple systems failed. But it was still flying, still responding to her inputs, still doing what Fairchild Republic had designed it to do: take punishment and bring the pilot home. The flight back took 23 minutes that felt like hours. Weather had gotten worse, visibility near zero, wind buffeting the damaged aircraft. Evans flew on instruments and willpower, coaxing performance from systems that should have quit completely, nursing the Warthog through conditions that would have grounded healthier aircraft. She had to fly manually the entire way. The flight computers were glitching from electrical damage. Autopilot was inoperative. Even the trim system was barely functional. Every control input had to be precise, every adjustment calculated to account for the asymmetric thrust from having only 1 engine and the drag from the damaged tail section. It was like flying a truck with 3 flat tires through a hurricane, but she made it work, made tiny corrections every few seconds to keep the aircraft stable, compensated for the damaged aerodynamics by adjusting her airspeed and angle of attack, managed her fuel carefully, knowing that she had maybe 10 minutes of reserve and the base was still 15 minutes away at her current speed. She did the math in her head, calculated that she could squeeze out the extra distance if she climbed to a more efficient altitude and leaned the mixture on her remaining engine to maximum fuel economy. The climb was painfully slow with 1 engine and battle damage, but she made it to 12,000 feet where the thinner air required less fuel to maintain flight. The fuel gauge continued to drop. 90 gallons, 80, 70. She'd need at least 40 to execute a safe landing pattern, 65 gallons when she finally saw her base through a gap in the clouds. Close enough. She declared emergency for the second time that morning, was cleared for immediate landing, began her descent through weather that was actively trying to kill her one more time. Ice formed on her wings as she descended through freezing layers. The single engine hiccuped once, twice, ran rough for 10 terrifying seconds before smoothing out. Evans talked to the aircraft like it was a living thing. "Come on, baby, just a little further. You've brought me this far. Don't quit on me now," the Warthog responded, the engine finding its rhythm again, the controls becoming slightly more responsive as she dropped into warmer air where ice sublimated off the airframe. 5 miles from base. 3 miles. 1 mile. The runway appeared through the murk, emergency vehicles lining both sides, fire trucks and ambulances ready for the worst. Evans configured for landing, gear down, flaps down, accepting the extra drag because she needed the lower approach speed with her damaged flight controls. The landing was harder than she'd have liked. She hit the runway with more force than was ideal, the remaining landing gear taking the impact with a groan that she felt through the entire airframe. But the gear held, the tires didn't blow, and she was down safely, rolling out on centerline with emergency vehicles following her progress. She taxied to the maintenance area where the crew chief and his team were waiting. When she finally shut down the remaining engine and the noise stopped, when everything went quiet except for the creaking of cooling metal and the drip of leaking fluids, Evans sat there for a long moment. Her hands were shaking. Now that the adrenaline was fading, now that the immediate danger was past, her body was remembering that she'd just spent over an hour in mortal peril, flying a progressively more damaged aircraft through combat that should have killed her multiple times. But she'd survived. The A-10 had survived. The mission was complete. She climbed out of the cockpit on legs that felt like rubber, accepted the crew chief's steadying hand when she nearly stumbled on the ladder, stood on solid ground for the first time in over 90 minutes, and looked at the aircraft that had brought her home. The damage was extensive. The crew chief and his team were walking around the Warthog with expressions that ranged from shock to professional admiration. They counted holes, over 70 punctures in the airframe from anti-aircraft fire. The vertical stabilizer was half gone, torn away by missile fragmentation. Engine 2 was a total loss, the casing holed in multiple places, turbine blades visible through shrapnel damage. Hydraulic lines were severed, electrical conduits were exposed, the belly of the aircraft was scorched from the engine fire she'd suppressed in flight. "Ma'am," the crew chief said finally, "I don't know how you flew this thing back. By all rights, it should be scattered across that valley in pieces." Evans looked at the battered Warthog, at the aircraft that had taken everything the enemy could throw at it and still completed the mission. "She's built for it. That's the whole point of the A-10. Take the hits, keep fighting, bring the pilot home." Today, she did exactly that. "We're going to need at least 2 weeks to get her airworthy again," the chief said, already making notes on his tablet. "Maybe longer depending on what we find when we start tearing into the systems. This is the most battle damage I've ever seen on an aircraft that was still flying." "Take your time," Evans replied. "Do it right. She earned it." The debrief went on for hours. Intelligence wanted every detail of the engagement: weapons employment, target assessment, damage infliction, enemy capabilities. Colonel Masters wanted to understand how she'd overcome obstacles that had defeated previous attempts. Other pilots wanted to learn from her tactics, to understand how she'd pushed the A-10 to its absolute limits, and survived. Evans walked them through everything with professional precision. She described the low-altitude approach through deteriorating weather, the initial maverick strikes that caught the column by surprise, the gun runs that had destroyed the bulk of the armor, the SAM evasion that had saved her life multiple times, the Shilka engagement that had nearly brought her down, the psychological warfare she'd employed when her ammunition ran out, the artillery coordination that had finished the last 2 tanks. By the time she finished, every pilot in the room understood that what she'd done wasn't reckless or lucky. It was the product of years of training combined with intimate knowledge of her aircraft's capabilities, tactical flexibility when the situation changed, and absolute determination to complete the mission regardless of obstacles. 35 tanks, Masters said when the official debrief ended and only the two of them remained. Every single one destroyed or captured. Solo mission, impossible weather, heavy air defenses, and you brought the aircraft back despite battle damage that should have been fatal. The A-10 brought me back, sir, Evans corrected. I just steered. The aircraft did the heavy lifting. That's what it was designed for. Survive conditions that would kill other planes, complete missions that other platforms can't, and bring the pilot home alive. Masters smiled. You know they are going to study this mission for decades. You just proved what's possible when skill meets determination meets the right aircraft. Evans nodded, too tired to be modest. Good. Maybe next time Command says something's impossible, they'll remember that impossible just means send an A-10. She stood to leave, exhaustion finally overwhelming her, ready for the mandatory crew rest that would let her recover from the most intense 90 minutes of her life. Captain Evans, Masters said as she reached the door, you saved a lot of ground troops today. That column was heading for our forward positions. Without you stopping them, we'd have faced those 35 tanks in direct combat tomorrow. You prevented casualties we can't even calculate. That matters. Evans allowed herself a small smile. Thank you, sir. That's why we fly. That's why we train. So when the impossible mission comes along, we're ready to make it possible. She walked out into the evening. She'd been in debrief so long that day had turned to dusk, heading for crew quarters and sleep that would come the moment her head hit the pillow. Behind her, the Warthog sat in its maintenance bay, surrounded by technicians who were already beginning the painstaking work of bringing it back to full operational status. The aircraft had proven itself once again, had demonstrated why the A-10 remained relevant decades after its introduction, why pilots who flew it developed an almost religious devotion to its capabilities, why enemies feared the distinctive shape and the devastating gun it carried. Command had said no pilot could hit that column in those conditions. They'd been thinking about risk assessment, about survival probability, about all the reasons to abort before committing to an impossible mission. But they'd forgotten that some pilots didn't calculate risk the same way. Some pilots looked at impossible missions and saw problems to be solved through superior skill, better tactics, and refusal to accept defeat. Some pilots flew an aircraft that was specifically designed to succeed in conditions that would ground everything else. Captain Willow Evans was that kind of pilot. The A-10 was that kind of aircraft. Together, they'd proven that impossible was just a word people used before someone showed them what determined capability looked like in action. 35 tanks destroyed. Mission complete. 0 tanks reached their objective. Ground forces saved. Strategic victory achieved. Just another day in the life of an A-10 driver. The Warthog way. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring tales of courage.